This is a review of the 1966 Robert Wise film, The Sand, Pebbles. This is a phenomenal movie that I strongly recommend, although there are a few asterisks and a few things to know about that I will explain, but overall, great movie, really my kind of movie, extremely interesting movie, like I said, directed by Robert Wise. That's the guy who directed The Sound of Music, and in fact, he directed The Sound of Music just as a little holdover project to keep producers happy while he was trying to get The Sand Pebbles made, worked on, and finished. The Sand Pebbles ended up being a huge odyssey to get made. We'll talk about why, and ultimately, it's a huge movie that I'm surprised more people haven't seen. This movie is more well-known than most of the movies I've done on this channel. I think it has about 14K votes on IMDb or something like that, and it was nominated for 8 Academy Awards, so it's not like nobody has heard of this, but still, it's surprising to me that this movie is not held up alongside of things like Lawrence of Arabia or The Bridge on the River Kwai or Dr. Zhivago, big international movies. I think this movie should be considered as one of these. Like I said, not without its complications, but we'll talk about all of that. So I came to this movie because the screenplay is written by Robert Anderson. Robert Anderson wrote the screenplay for one of my all-time favorite movies, The Nun Story. He also wrote the screenplay, wrote the play that the movie I Never Sang for My Father, which I reviewed recently on this channel and is also phenomenal, is based on. And I thought, man, I have to see as much Robert Anderson as I possibly could. So I watched The Sand Pebbles. The screenplay, like I said, was Robert Anderson, but it's based on a book by Richard McKenna, who was a real sailor on the Yangtze River Patrol in the 1920s in China, which is where this movie is set. That said, despite this being based on a real thing, a lot of people think of this movie as an allegory for the Vietnam War, and you'll see why. This movie stars Steve McQueen in potentially the most Steve McQueen-esque role out there. I think one of his strongest roles by far. It's got Richard Attenborough and Candice Bergen. Like I said, this movie is set in China in 1928. And so it also has some Asian actors who I guess are supposed to be Chinese, but mainly aren't. It's got Mako, who's a Japanese actor who's in a number of things in sort of the 60s and before, and it's got Emmanuelle Arsan, I don't know how to pronounce her name, but who's a Thai actress, and they were both playing Chinese characters. The asterisks about this movie are definitely sort of these interesting casting choices and a few dated or potentially not politically correct moments. I'll talk more about those. Overall, like I said, I think this is totally a movie worth watching. So this movie is based on a book, like I said, and this movie is novel-esque. It is a novel story in a lot of ways. First of all, it's a novel story in the uncommon sense of the word novel, right? So this story is about just sort of a time and a place that you really do not see very often in movies that I had really no idea about. Like I said, it's set in China in 1928, in particular Changsha, I guess, which is on the Yangtze River, I guess. And it mainly takes place aboard the San Pablo, which is an American gunboat. So this is part of the Yangtze River Patrol, which was some effort by the United States to protect lasting American interests in China. And this is happening sort of at the backdrop of general political unrest in China in the late 1920s, I guess just prior to the rise of Chiang Kai-shek. There would have been just sort of regional warring. I don't really know anything about this, but you can look it up if you want to. This is a complicated and interesting historical backdrop that the movie completely does justice to, in that it's a complicated movie. This is not a historical documentary about China by any means. But the complexity of the situation is borne out in the movie because there are a lot of different characters, a lot of different sort of categories of character in this movie that all have distinct priorities, that all act on these, and that leads to just an incredibly sort of complex conflicts and interesting pieces. So, for instance, you have the local Chinese people who've got sort of one set of priorities, and this is actually slightly more complicated because it's divided into the local Chinese people and then also people who might be part of Chiang Kai-shek's party, who might be Chinese soldiers. And then you also hear a little bit briefly at one point about the young student revolutionaries in China, which I think fall into a slightly different category, although this is not a major division in the film. One big complication, though, that is in the movie is that you also have Chinese people who are working on board the ship, who are helping out the Americans, being paid, I guess, but who are working on the engines and things like that. So you've got two very distinct, actually even really three very distinct categories of the local Chinese people, because you also have people who are in sort of service industries. Like a lot of this movie takes place in a brothel, where there are sort of local Chinese women who are catering, I guess, to the soldiers, and they have, again, another set of priorities and perspectives. So already, this is only the Chinese, and already you see there's a lot of different sort of characters and a lot of different motivations at play. You also have missionaries in this movie. So you've got American missionaries who Steve McQueen meets at the very beginning of the movie, and who he bumps into again and again throughout. And the missionaries have quite different priorities than the soldiers, than the people on the gunboat. Even on the gunboat, though, there are, again, lots of categories. Like I said, there's the Chinese there, but there are also the officers. The captain of the ship in particular has a very strong personality, an extremely interesting character we'll talk a little bit more about. Then there's the enlisted men who feel a bit differently about things, are much more practical, looking out for their own backs or something along those lines. And then there's Steve McQueen, who doesn't really fit into any of these categories and is quite a bit of an outlaw. They accuse him of being a Jonah time and time again. That's, I think, a person you don't want on your ship. But like I said, these are, I think, that might not even be all of them, but those are all the different types of characters in the movie that all have really sort of orthogonal and unique motivations, and that come together to produce really interesting conflicts that emerge sort of slowly, but end up being, complex. This movie is long. It's over 3 hours, 3 hours and 2 minutes, I think, or something like that, and it has an intermission and overture, so it's not quite that long, but it is long, and it feels sort of long. It's not super fast-paced. It's episodic, so there are 3 or 4 sort of different parts of the movie, which this, I think, is sort of common in things that are adapted from big novels. You start out with Steve McQueen just sort of showing up and getting to know the ship, and there's some interesting moments there, learning about his feelings about the locals and such. Then there's sort of a long period that's kind of almost sort of a nightlife thing that really focuses on this brothel, like I said, where the soldiers take a lot of their liberty. And here you have some pretty interesting themes of exploitation and conflict between the locals and the soldiers. Then you've got a section that's much more romantic, and this section is really pretty moving, pretty strong, I think. And then the last sort of quarter of the movie is much more like sort of an adventurous war movie, and this is pretty intense and really great. Throughout all of these, there are a lot of angles and a lot of complications. I think the only criticism I really have of this movie, well, besides some things about casting and such, which we'll talk about, and authenticity, the only other criticism is that at times it feels like maybe part of this big book that got turned into a movie, they left a few chapters out. And there are a couple of moments that aren't totally explained, just a couple of things where you wonder, wait a minute, how did this character get here? How do these people know each other? How did they? And it just seems like this would have been in the book, but didn't quite make it in the movie. And none of these sink the ship, but there are certainly a few moments like that. There are also a couple of sort of accelerated plot lines, particularly with Steve McQueen. In the beginning, I won't spoil much of the movie, but he starts out not being too fond of the Chinese locals, and his views evolve somewhat, and it happens sort of abruptly in some ways. And that is something that it seems like the book might do a better job of carrying out. But like I said, foremost virtue of this movie is surely just the complexity of the story. And to be honest, it's an order of magnitude more interesting than the average historical drama. All the historical dramas I mentioned earlier, for instance, with Lawrence of Arabia, or The Bridge on the River Kwai. I mean, these are good movies. Dr. Zhivago, I think, is actually up there. It's a pretty interesting movie. But this movie, I think, tops all of those. Maybe not in overall quality, because some of those movies are pretty good. One of them's pretty overrated, I think. But some of those movies are really great. This movie, though, I think, more complex. It just has more interlocking pieces and more just interesting conflict. Like I said, it's also just, you're really out there. We, I think, in our heads have some sense of some of the settings of some of those other movies and some of the ideas. But it seems like there'd be very few people who'd be familiar with this setting and with these circumstances, at least not too many Americans. And that's interesting. And despite that, it ends up being a totally convincing movie, at least from the American perspective. So this, I think the secondary virtue of this movie is that it is an enormous production. So, like I said, it took a long time to make this movie. It was filmed not quite on location, but it was filmed in Taiwan and Hong Kong. They actually built the boat that's in the movie. There's also some scenes that are sort of in more urban areas that are really nicely put together. Overall, this film is shot in Panavision and looks amazing. The cinematography in this movie is great, and just the look of the movie is really, really nice. Again, easily competing with any of those big historical dramas I mentioned earlier, which are also sort of famous for their look in some ways. This is up there with the production quality and with the scale. There's one scene in particular where they go to the Boom, which is sort of a frigate of Chinese junks, basically, that are in the bay somewhere. I won't spoil anything about this, but watching that, you get this moment you get sometimes when you watch old pre-CGI movies of like, wow, they really built all that, and like this is actually real, and this is, wow, like that, quite a production. A lot of the movie takes place on the boat, and so it's not sort of a mind-blowing scope at all times, but you see the boat in the bay, for instance, and it looks like, wow, this is like, that's real, like that's pretty cool. And there are a few scenes, particularly towards the end, where the scale really increases, and the movie is just all there all the way. A lot of the times when you watch sort of like maybe a television show, you can see the gaps here. You can see the places where they've cut corners and where the cost has prevented them, and it either manifests by having to avoid showing certain things, or the spaceship just looks remarkably cheap, or something like that. And it really holds the scale of the production back. This is totally the opposite, where it seems like any direction the movie would go in, the world would be there. It would be real, it'd be laid out, and you'd get to experience it. The movie also has a nice score that has some sort of interesting, just sort of tokenish Oriental themes here at times. But in general, I think is a pretty good score. And I was struck by how good the acoustic imaging in the soundtrack of this is. And I think partly this is because this was made during sort of the roadshow time in movies, where this would have been maybe shown in like a Cinerama type setting, filmed in Panavision. And that was a time when people actually did care to some extent about like the audio and such. Since this is also a fairly famous movie, it's been remastered and such since then. But like I said, the acoustic imaging of the movie is great, and the music more generally is good too. So there are some sort of complications with this movie that might put some people off. I mentioned the casting already, but I think more generally there's sort of an unflinching nature to this movie. If you were to watch, well, a good example, we could look at a different Vietnam allegory. If we look at the television show MASH, that is a progressive show that's basically anti-war, and in general puts forward the idea that we shouldn't be invading in other countries, or we should at least be nice to the people in other countries. And so there's plenty of episodes about like, you have the bad guy or something, Frank Burns or something like this, who's just sort of comedically small-minded, cartoonishly unworldly, will do something that's sort of exploitative towards local Koreans or something. But he gets his comedic comeuppance at the end at the hands of the angelic protagonists and such. And so for the most part, most of the people on the show are great and nice, and they're doing everything they can. But you have these sort of cartoonish villains. That is one view. And that's like a very didactic morality play about like, yeah, we should be nice. We should not invade countries, things like that. This movie really takes a different approach, where nobody is much of an angel. Like I said in the beginning of the movie, Steve McQueen, not really clear that he's much of a fan of the Chinese, uses some derogatory terms, as most characters in the movie do. And Steve McQueen's views evolve somewhat, but it's by no means like I've learned, I love the Chinese now, or anything like that. He, throughout, has a complicated and uncertain moral perspective, as do most of the Americans in the movie. And like I said, it's a fairly unflinching view of that. A lot of people just being sort of practical, I guess, or small-minded, looking out for their own interests, and harboring pretty dim views. I mean, Steve McQueen at the beginning of the movie basically says that he's the engineer in the movie who's in charge of the engine. He doesn't want any of the local Chinese people on the ship. to help with the engine because he thinks they're too dumb to know how to use it. And like I said, his viewpoint changes, but he never finds moral certainty about that. So basically, this movie it's not a morality play. It's not politically correct. And if you look at this with sort of some of the suspicious casting decisions, then yeah, I mean, I can understand how that could be off-putting. At the same time, I think that really the unflinching nature, like casting, yeah, I'm not a fan of that. But the unflinching nature of the movie, I think in some ways might actually be a virtue of the movie, where the sort of ham-fisted morality play of MASH or something like that makes us sort of feel good, and it's the progressive morality, is ahistorical, basically, and maybe there is some value. In fact, I think there certainly is for showing some things more along the lines of what they actually were, for not having some sort of racial fantasy, basically, about how it's just a few bad apples who, in the end, will get their comedic comeuppance. But, fundamentally, the Americans are good and are just sort of in a bad position or something like that. This movie is a completely different approach to that. Like I said, a Vietnam War allegory that is, in a lot of ways, I think, much more damning than something like MASH, or something that is going to try to be a little bit more palatable, generally. This sort of unflinching nature and the relationship between the sort of Chinese and the Americans changes throughout the movie. And with those like sort of 3 or 4 episodes I mentioned in the beginning, you see 3 very different sort of ways of interacting. Like I said in the beginning, you have sort of a servitude and exploitation through the brothel. In the middle, there's sort of a more romantic view of things, and towards the end, you get sort of direct armed conflict. So the movie really covers a lot of bases in this relationship and shows a lot of perspectives, and I think overall does a good job. But I can understand that there could easily be telling historical mistakes in the film. There are interesting casting decisions, and there is terminology that you might be surprised to hear and put off by. Like I said, this is sort of the ultimate Steve McQueen movie in some ways. This isn't too far from the sort of character Steve McQueen really plays, but I think that it dials in some qualities that take this above some of his other movies. So Steve McQueen is sort of he's kind of an action hero, so he's a smooth and tough character, but he's also a pretty ragged character, a vulnerable character, an unlucky character and such. If you look at The Great Escape, for instance, he's the guy who always ends up in the cooler, right? He's the guy who always gets punished. He's the guy who's always sort of unlucky. If you see like Papillon and whatnot, he's the guy who will be suffering and such. And so there is sort of this sort of vulnerable underside of Steve McQueen in his better roles. And this movie, I think, even plays into that more, where Steve McQueen is uncertain throughout this movie. I said he's the engineer. And in the beginning of the movie, all he cares about is the engine, right? He's totally set on that. He gets on the ship. He wants to be taken straight to the engine and such. Well, later in the movie, he tells Candice Bergen. Candice Bergen asks him about the engine, how it's going. And he says, well, it seems like it's not so important anymore. And I won't spoil any of the things that might lead to that. But an uncertain role throughout that ends up being powerful. And he's given a few moments there's a number of moments, especially towards the end of the movie, where he's really given room to contemplate, and where the camera essentially just shows him sitting in a corner and thinking. And these end up being extremely powerful moments. So I think that by sort of dialing up the vulnerability, that's sort of it's sort of there in all of Steve McQueen's roles, but he's often a bit more streetwise than he is in this movie. And in this movie, I mean, he is streetwise, but he's not exactly wise, if you know what I mean. He's tough, maybe, but hugely uncertain, and I think ends up being a really strong character. So there's so many great things about this movie, I think, and let me, I guess, just go through some other virtues. For one thing, this is a deliberate movie. I mean, I mentioned already that the pacing is sort of slow, and I think that might put some people off. But one thing that's sort of interesting from the deliberate pacing of the movie is that some of the fighting, especially, there's more fighting in the last sort of third of the movie, is filmed very deliberately. This is not sort of an action movie where the fight's about to start and you cue the Dropkick Murphys song or something like that, and everyone has this really stylish fighting. that goes on. This is here the fighting is much more awkward and much more sort of stilted. The scene with the boom, for instance, it's not some really briskly edited thing. Instead, there's waiting. There's uncertainty. And when there's actual hand-to-hand combat, again, it's not Marvel superheroes doing backflips and such. It's sort of awkward and a bit of a slog, which is pretty interesting. I mentioned already that the characters are orthogonal. I've mentioned in other videos. I have this idea of orthogonality that I like in movies where characters are shown not to all be together basically because they're in the same movie and are in the same place, but where the differences in people's life and paths and priorities is really highlighted, and where ultimately characters are shown to all be sort of on their separate journeys, which might cross at certain points, and that really comes to the front in this movie. There are a number of times where it seems like maybe characters are coming together where things might not end up how you expect. And ultimately, I highlighted the 5 or 6 different categories of people in the end. Ultimately, those backgrounds and those different journeys end up being pretty decisive in terms of how things go. So I think this does a good job, gets a high orthogonality score from me. Another thing that struck me about this movie is the general theme of trying to make plans in a chaotic world, which really resonates with us these days, I suppose. There's a lot of sort of thinking on your feet. There's a lot of not really knowing what the heck you should be doing in this movie. And one of the things that I think is really nice about this movie is that it exposes to some extent the myth of definitive moments, where you would think sometimes, well, movies sort of train us that there will be definitive moments in life, right? That there will be things that you can say that really change the course of how things go, that there'll be these big twists that are summed up in a single moment, right? This is like baked into the drama of a movie. But this movie kind of goes the other way, where a lot of these moments don't really stick. There are a number of moments in this movie, for instance, where someone will make sort of a big proclamation that you would think would be a big deal, and then about 10 seconds later, something else happens. A messenger walks in, and it turns out the circumstances are totally different. And it's hard to make these plans. And there's a number of plans that are sort of attempted that people, they plan to do, they hope to do, and they attempt to undertake that don't really come out how you would expect. And I really like that, where there are some attempted definitive moments in this movie, but none of them really work very much. And like I said, a lot of uncertainty in this movie, and a lot of a feeling of powerlessness, which I think is a really interesting, and you don't see in movies very often, because again, one of the sort of fundamental dramatic elements of movies is that characters do things and it changes stuff. And so powerlessness, how do you make a movie where characters are powerless? Well, there are some where characters are persecuted, right? You might look at movies about martyrdom, The Crucible, or The Passion of Joan of Arc, or something like that, where there are characters where it's like, oh, look how powerless you are, and all the sort of things conspire against them. It's rare, I think, to see movies with so many just sort of not really successfully carried out plans and just uncertain moments. And that really struck me about this movie. Like I said, maybe now is the events of the world make that really resonate. But it struck me about this movie. I guess a final mention is a particularly strong character in this movie. I mean, a lot of the characters are really great. But there's one particularly strong character, which is the captain of the ship, played by Richard Crenna. And this character does a really good job of sort of showing, to some extent, kind of the American military perspective of things, without it sort of descending into farce. So it's like borderline kind of satirical in some ways, but also completely serious. And this is one thing, you watch like a show like MASH, I mentioned Frank Burns in that show. It takes the role of being speaking for the sort of American military. And he's a completely comedic and satirical character that just seems sort of hugely over the top at times, and is probably the part of the show that's maybe aged worst in some ways, because his character is just so over the top. Here, the captain has a similar kind of role in speaking for the military, and it borders on satirical sometimes, but it's still fundamentally serious and ultimately pretty interesting. And this is also a dynamic character over the course of the movie as things change. His relationship with the men changes, and his relationship with the orders he gets changes, and the things going on up here shift. This ends up being a really complex and interesting character. like a lot of these characters in the movie, this movie sort of makes you want to read the book in some ways, because you get a really good sense of complex characters here, but in some ways you want to know them even better. You want to zoom in even more and know more details about their changes in their lives, which presumably would be in the book. I'd also mention that this Richard Crenna actor and the captain has major Bryan Cranston vibes for some reason. Kind of looks like him, sort of acts like him, which distracted me a bit. But overall, a really interesting character, and really just one of many interesting, very carefully constructed characters in this movie. You get a lot of characters with a lot of different motivations and ideas and goals and backgrounds, and you have a really vivid backdrop for things with a complicated context, and ultimately what arises are interesting and complex conflicts with a lot of moving parts and a lot of pieces, but not so many moving parts in that it feels like it's some sort of clockwork, like some sort of 1940s noir film or something where everything kind of lines up in some ways. A much more downcast version in some ways, where there are a lot of different pieces, but it's not really clear. They don't all fit together in some nice clockwork. Instead, the pieces are all just sort of brought to the table, and it's not really clear how things are going to go, and yet conflicts, potent conflicts arise. And the movie basically does an extremely good job of taking a really complicated scenario and putting it into conflict that is easy to understand and like easy to latch onto and enjoyable to watch, but that still captures all the complexities of things. So overall, no secret, I really liked this movie. Like I said, there are maybe some off-putting things in it, and it's kind of going to be up to you whether or not, what you feel about that. For me, I really enjoyed this movie. Really interesting, and again, a huge win for Robert Anderson. I'm sure there will be at least one more. I think Tea and Sympathy is coming up soon. There'll be at least one more Robert Anderson review coming up. But for now, I would just encourage you to check out The Sand Pebbles, a historical drama that is on another level in terms of the plot and how interesting and complex the conflicts end up being.